Hey Finxters, in this video we are going to discuss how to accept a valid input from a user in Python. So without further delay, let us jump into our programming screen right away. And now let's visualize the problem that we are going to solve here. So suppose we have a variable age which checks or accepts an input from the user such that if the value of age is greater than or equal to 18, then the result will be you are an adult, otherwise it will be you are not an adult. Now please note that age is an integer variable. So let's see what happens. So what is your age? I enter 25, so it says you are an adult. However, what if I enter something which is not an integer? Suppose I enter my name. Now what is the output? As you can see, we have a value error. This is because I entered a string instead of an integer. So this is what we want to avoid, and we want to tell the user that the input was a wrong entry and the user needs to enter the age yet again. So let's see how we can do that. To do that, I'll be explaining you three methods. So I'll try to keep it short for you. Therefore, I'll explain you the codes one by one, or the methods that we are going to use one by one. So let us have a look. Let me clear out the screens. And now, in the first method, we are going to implement the input validation using a while loop. And then we will implement exception handling. So let us quickly go through the code. We have our while loop, and inside the while loop we have the try and except blocks. Within the try block, we are accepting the age from the user, which happens to be an integer variable. However, if the user enters a wrong input, as we saw in our example before, if the user enters a string, then we get a value error. So if in case we get a value error, in that case we will print please enter a valid age, and then we use the continue keyword. Now since we are using the continue keyword, it will help us to escape the current iteration of the while loop and then move on to the next iteration. So that means we will again enter into the try block and the user has to enter his age again. So let's check that out before we move on to the next phase of the program. Suppose I have a wrong entry, which is a string. So as you can see, please enter a valid age, and the control moves into the try block yet again. Now let me input a correct age or an integer value, and now it's the correct output that we want. What if I enter something which is not greater than 0? In that case, we enter into the else block. This means if there was no exception in our program, however, we also want to check if the age entered is a valid value. What do I mean by that? It means that an age cannot be a negative integer, or it cannot be 0. So the age has to be greater than 0. If not, then we print age should be greater than 0. So this is the logic behind this piece of code. So let's check each case one by one. In the first case, as we already checked, I'm entering a string which should give me the following output: please enter a valid age. Now again I move into the try block. Now let me try something which is less than 0, maybe minus 25, and now let's check. Now you can see that the control moves in to this part: age should be greater than 0, and again it moves on to the try block. Now I'll finally input a correct age, 25, and now we finally have the output that we want. Now this brings us to the next method. Before that, let me quickly clear out the screen. In the second method, we are going to use an external library by the name PyInput+. Therefore, before proceeding, I must remind you that you have to install this library because it is not a part of Python's standard library. Therefore, we already have our variable age, which accepts the age from the user in the form of an integer. Now, how do I tell Python that it is an integer? We can do that using PyInput+'s input_int function. So when I use input_int, it tells Python that the user has to input an integer value. Then inside the function we have a prompt which tells the user, please enter your age. We have another argument, minimum, min, as you can see, min. I have specified it to be 1. This is because if the user enters anything which is below 0 or below 1, then we get an output which prompts the user that the number must be a minimum of 1. So let me show that to you. Let's run our code. I'll enter 0. Now, as you can see, the user is prompted to enter a number which must be a minimum of 1. So I hope this was clear to you. Now we have our if-else blocks such that if the age is greater than 18, then the output is you are an adult, and if it's lesser than 18, then we have you are not an adult. So let's check each scenario one by one. So I'll enter a string in the beginning. Now Shubham is not an integer, so I must enter an integer in the age. Now I enter a negative value. Now the number must be a minimum at 1. So I must enter a value which is greater than 0. So now I'll enter something which is greater than 0, maybe 5. Now it prints you are not an adult. Now that brings us to the final method. In this method, we are going to use recursion. However, please note that you should not be using recursion unless absolutely needed, because it has its downsides. For example, if the user keeps entering a wrong output for numerous number of times, then that will hamper your code and you'll get a runtime error. So without further delay, let us have a look at the method. We are going to use recursion. So we have a function by the name validInput. Inside the function, we have our try and accept blocks, wherein we accept the age of the user in the variable age, which happens to be an integer value. If it is not an integer, that is if the user enters a string, then we print please enter a valid age. The age must be a numerical value. And now we return the function again. So this is what we are doing. We are recursively calling the function again and again until and unless the user enters a correct age. We also have another scenario where the age can be less than 0. So we also need to define our condition for that. So if age is less than or equal to 0, in that case we are printing your age must be a positive numerical value, and then we again return the function itself. That means the function calls itself again and again until the user enters a correct age or a correct input value. So this is exactly what recursion is. However, as I mentioned before, please make sure that you do not use recursion until and unless you are absolutely sure that the user is going to enter the correct value within a few attempts. Otherwise, it's going to hamper your code and you are going to get a runtime error. That's why I kept it as the number 3 method in order to solve our problem. So as you can see, outside the function we have a variable x which calls the function valid input. From valid input, if the user enters a correct age, then the program comes out to this part and checks if it's greater than 18, then it will print you are an adult, otherwise it will print you are not an adult. So let's check that. So enter your age. So I'll enter a string in the beginning. So as you can see, we have please enter a valid age. The age must be a numerical value. And once this is printed, the function is called yet again and we are inside our try block again and we have to enter the age once again. So I'll enter a negative value this time, maybe -12. So as you can see, we again have a prompt saying your age must be a positive numerical value. That means we are at this part of the program now, and then the function calls itself yet again. Once it calls itself, we are again inside the try block and we are asked to input a correct age. Now finally let's print a correct age. Let it be 50. And finally we have the desired output. You are an adult. So I hope this was clear to you and you can now use any of these 3 methods in your program to ensure that the user enters a correct input. Now that brings us to the end of this video. If you learned something from it, please give it a like and do not forget to subscribe our channel. Goodbye.